Hello and a warm welcome to HW News Network, your one-stop show, truth be told, for some engaging and thought-provoking conversations. Donald Trump wins. India's oil giants will be forced off the Russian crude by threat of financial sanctions. This is by and large mostly the headlines seen in the leading newspapers. In fact, this is a lead story, and I'm going to tell you the details of this. Now, India's top oil companies will start cutting back on purchases of Russian crude oil in the very near future after the US imposed sanctions on two top Russian oil giants, that is Rosneft and Lukoil. Now, the news about the US sanctions sent global oil prices shooting up in the last 2 days by 3 or 5% to a peak of $66.02 a barrel. Now, the US, what a Reliance spokesperson has told and spoken to the few newspapers, he's quoted as saying that US has given companies time till November 21st to wind down their transactions with the Russian oil producers, according to the release on sanctions. This is a Reliance spokesperson who's spoken to a few newspapers. But what does it mean for India? US imposing sanctions on the Russian oil companies. What does it mean for India? What does it mean for Modi? What does it mean for India-US relationship? And most significantly, it's almost like Modi abandoning Vladimir Putin. Russia is the oldest ally of India, and in fact, a great friend of India. Where have we reached as far as our relationship with Russia is concerned? Are we not in a catch-22 situation when it comes to these the issues around the oil deal which has happened, and how Donald Trump has forced Prime Minister Modi to reach a situation like this? Joining me this evening is Professor Mohsin Raza, who is a columnist and international affairs expert. Thank you so much, Mohsin, for joining. And it's a very, very important story. In fact, a leading story of all the newspapers today, that how Donald Trump has succeeded in forcing India to give up on its oil purchases with Russia. What would you really say to this kind of a situation which has arrived now?
So the government was looking for a compromise for quite a while. If you recall, we were slapped with 25% base and then 25% punitive tariffs. The extra 25% punitive was for trading oil with Russia by Donald Trump. So the government realized that this is affecting a large percentage of India's exports to the US. India largely has trade deficits with almost all its trading partners. The US is an exception, where we have a trade surplus. These punitive sanctions of about 50% affect about 55% of our exports to the US. And they really affect the medium and small enterprises. Now, if this was affecting large enterprises, it would be one thing, but medium and small enterprises are also the largest employers. That is, most of our population and jobs are in MSMEs. So the government was looking for a way out. Prime Minister Modi was looking for a way out, and he has finally found it with this excuse that further sanctions have been imposed by the US and the Europeans. The government and its sources are misleading the newspapers, including the Indian Express, etc., which are reporting that secondary sanctions are what we are scared of. Secondary sanctions means that whoever trades with these companies will also come under sanction. That's not true. The US has not imposed secondary sanctions. They're lying and misleading the public, both the sources and the newspapers. US has imposed sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, basically these two big Russian oil giants, and Europeans have also imposed some sanctions on them and on some of the what is called the shadow fleet, some ships, hundreds of more ships. So we are looking for an excuse. The government was looking for an excuse. Prime Minister Modi was looking for an excuse, and he has found it. And they're going to now start even more drastically reducing their oil purchases. In fact, if you look at the announcement that Donald Trump made about us reducing Russian oil purchases, it came well before, almost a week before these sanctions. So that means we had already indicated to the Americans, possibly in our trade negotiations or directly to their ministry and to the White House, that we are going to reduce.
What does it mean? Because when back home, Prime Minister Modi says that we will not compromise, S. Shankar was saying that we will not compromise with the Indian interests. And now, if we end up doing this, what is this act then?
Well, it's clearly a bowing down in front of the United States. We have, in a way, surrendered part of our sovereignty. That is, we have been doing this in the past. In 2018-19, we did this first with Iranian oil, which was also extremely cheap, much cheaper than, in fact, the Russian oil. They used to also pay for the insurance and the transportation. So it used to come out quite cheap for us. But because of the US sanctions on Iran and Israeli pressure on the US, we stopped purchasing some very cheap oil. In fact, in that case, there were some secondary sanction threats. But in this case, there are none. It primarily is because we have been coerced, and it shows that far from being a Vishwaguru and a rising power that was being trumpeted all over the world, we are actually a middling and possibly even a weak power in some ways. That is, we have given into this kind of coercion by the US, and it sets a bad precedent. We have now set up a precedent where we can be pressurized again and again.
But forget what has been happening between India and United States because of so many reasons we don't know. Because there's a lot of things which are happening backroom or behind the curtains. No one knows that. But what about this situation where we have abandoned on our oldest and longest ally, which is Russia, a great friend? And we have even messed up with our relationship now with Russia. How is Vladimir Putin going to react to a decision like this? Because even if Prime Minister Modi does it incrementally, so slowly and gradually, but I'm sure Russia is getting the message very, very clear that because of Donald Trump, India is giving up on Russia.
Absolutely, and Putin is going to be furious. Russia still accounts for 60% of our existing weapon stocks.
No, so
that is their Russian origin.
Just allow me to interrupt you. So you are saying that after Trump now, India will have to face Putin's wrath as well, or Russia's wrath?
Absolutely. You will have to face Russia's wrath, and Putin will be very angry because this was one of his main sources of income. Oil exports accounted for about 25% of the Russian budget. And India was almost importing as much oil as China. These were the two main importers of Russian oil. Turkey was a distant third. So if India stops purchasing, Putin will definitely be aggrieved, and he will see this as a betrayal because Russia has always stood by us in the form of the Soviet Union. During the 1971 war, they stood by us when America was threatening us with the Seventh Fleet and others. Repeatedly, it provided us with very cheap weapons and did technology transfers. It transferred, in fact, even the BrahMos is actually a Russian weapon. So is our Agnis and all of that. They are cryogenic engines given by the Russians. So we will be seen as abandoning Russia at a time of its need. And Putin can put pressure on us by delaying many of the things that we have ordered, including air defense missiles like the S-400 and S-500.
No, so you are saying that Putin can suspend the defense deals which India has signed with Russia?
He won't suspend them because he needs the money, and suspension will be too severe. But he can delay them, which can come actually as close to suspension as possible, because if suppose he delays it by a few years, that means there will be gaps in our air defense with respect to China and Pakistan.
And which means that our security apparatus can then get impacted. Our armed forces can get impacted because of that.
Especially when we are claiming that Operation Sindoor is still underway. That is, we can anytime attack Pakistan again, as they are saying, "Ghar mein ghus ke marenge." Then you will be left, uncovered. Because if Pakistan replies, then you won't have air defenses. So it's putting India in a precarious position, both with respect to Pakistan and China.
I'm still wondering, Mohsin, that is it a bad decision making? Is it a complete failure of our foreign policy? Of course, it does look like that. But what about the people sitting in the External Affairs Ministry? What were they doing all this while? Jai Shankar visited America, Piyush Goyal visited America. All that seems to have resulted in a big failure.
India's foreign policy has been in a death spiral for the last few years. I mean, you can see it clearly. We made a fatal mistake to begin with. We went and joined so many different alliances. And these are two opposing alliances. That is the Quad on one side, which is the Americans and others, Japanese and Australians, and they expected us to take actions against China. And on the other side, we went and sat in the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where Russia and China expected us to take their side. Instead, we should have followed a policy of non-alignment, as we had done under Nehru. That is, we should have not sat with anyone. We should have been kind of autonomous and independent. By sitting in both these camps, we were put under pressure on both sides. On one side, start purchasing Russian oil, don't cooperate with the United States. On another side, cooperate with the United States and Japan, etc., and put pressure on China. So that resulted in the fiasco also partly of Doklam and finally at Ladakh, in Siachen. In Aksai Chin. So that whole area, the reason we got into a problem also, of course, was that fact that constantly foreign policy is being used for domestic election purposes. That is, if you see, we constantly berate Bangladesh as Muslim Ghuspetias, termites who are eating away India. The Modi media is encouraged to launch attacks on them. Similarly with Maldives, similarly with Turkey, with Malaysia. So the internal politics of elections, of polarization through Hindu-Muslim is playing out in the foreign policy also. So the foreign policy has become an instrument. Another way it's become an instrument is that a false impression has been created in front of the Indian voter and citizen that we have become Vishwa Gurus by hugging and kissing foreign leaders, which means that the domestic voter thinks that, hey, we have arrived. And this is thanks to the BJP and Prime Minister Modi, and therefore gives them votes. I'll give you a simple incident, with me. Before the 2019 elections, I was talking to a daily wage laborer, and he told me that he used to be a truck driver. And I said, what happened? He said, two things happened. One was the Notebandi, and then followed by the GST, which landed me in this position. I couldn't keep up with payments for my truck, and I've become a daily laborer. So I said, okay, so then who are you going to vote for? And he said, I'm going to vote for BJP and Prime Minister Modi. I said, why? He said, because he's made us a Vishwa Guru. He's raised our profile. It makes me proud, If that was the propaganda being sold here, it was at the cost of sitting on different tables and agreeing to whatever anybody said. But the problem is that those people have now called those checks. Those promises have now been called by the various parties, and we find ourselves torn between the two sides. So we have now first displeased the Americans, and now we are going to displease the Russians.
Absolutely. And two superpowers India will apparently not have on their side, which is such a significant failure as far as the foreign policy is concerned. But